Thank you so much for having me. It's cool to be in Goa because I realize we don't have spaces like this in Bangalore at all. And it's so interesting to find a space like MOG that hosts conversations that are important but that often don't find a real space. Uh, I think what I want to talk to you about today is kind of at the and I had a is kind of about where my academic work meets the work that I do currently, and it's an interesting time to talk about anything to do with food because food is really big now across the nation, particularly coffee. We're consuming more coffee than we ever have before. Um, what does that mean for growers on the ground? What does that mean for places where coffee is grown? Are interesting questions to ask, not just in India but across the world. We're also in the third consecutive year of a global deficit of coffee. So we are no longer producing the kind of coffee that the world's consuming, and that's created really interesting dynamics. Although we'll talk about coffee, I feel like, as I said, I want to place this in a larger conversation. No one's asked me that. Okay. Although we're talking about coffee, I think I want to place this in a larger conversation about food and also a larger conversation about what the role of the state is, because these are some of the things that we think about a lot as we try and do our work. Um, as um, as the introduction mentioned, I started an enterprise, and it's not at all about promoting a brand. I don't think that's the purpose of the conversation today at all. But the brand's an interesting lens through which to investigate some of the complexities of doing work like this that's at the grassroots. And the brand is called Black Baza, and Black Baza is a small bird of prey that's found across the Western Ghats and parts of Southeast Asia. So for us, it became an interesting species that was symbolic of the kind of farming practice that we'd like more and more growers across the country to follow. And we were recognized last year for across the globe for doing our work in sustainability. And it's the first time anybody from India was recognized, which is weird and sad because we've been growing coffee in India for 200 years. And there are many people who've done work in coffee before that. But why is Indian coffee not as sustainable as it could be is an interesting question. My academic research and my work now really kind of goes along these three things, right? There's coffee, but before coffee there was forest and wildlife. And every time I talk about the word biodiversity, that's what I mean. I mean non-humans on coffee farms. I don't mean necessarily fruit trees or other species that are intercropped with coffee. I'm specifically talking about farms as habitat for endangered wildlife. So before there was coffee, there was forest and wildlife wherever coffee is. And there's growers, and we'll talk a little bit more about who grows coffee in India. And then of course there's coffee. And we produce a lot of coffee. We're the seventh largest grower of coffee in the world. And I mean, I no longer know whether it's true because everybody says it, but supposedly coffee is the second most valued commodity after petroleum. But a lot of the storytelling around coffee, as you might see, is like fact mixed with myth making. So we're not sure what is what. If any of you haven't seen coffee before, this is what it looks like. It's a fruit that ripens once a year. And it's a drupe, so it's like mango. It has a hard seed. And once it ripens, it's picked. It is pulped. Yeah. So the outer fleshy part of coffee is removed. Sometimes it's fermented to enhance whatever flavor exists within the fruity pulp. And then it's dried. And then this is the first stage, which is called the roasting stage, where coffee tastes and smells and feels like what we're familiar with. Before that, it's very planty, can't really be eaten or consumed. Some non-humans consume it, and we'll talk about that. But largely, this is the first time coffee is familiar to us. It's only once it's roasted, and the process of roasting coffee is a little bit like putting popcorn in a popcorn machine. Yeah, it's a process of cooking it. There's moisture that comes out, and then it turns from green to black as the sugars in the bean caramelize. Where coffee is grown in India across the world is fascinating, because if you take a map of where coffee is grown and you overlay that where the world's biodiversity hotspots are, you find that those maps coincide almost identically. It's also a very, very clear case of coffee or a commodity being grown in the global south for the global north. So there's that inherent global trade with all of that political economy that goes behind how coffee is sold across the world. And as we talk a little bit about the history of coffee, you'll see that it really went from something that was grown in the forest to something that was consumed as a ritual to something that was spread by the empire to commodity. And then now the question is what? Like, if we took that commodity back into something that meant something for the people in the places where coffee is grown, what does that embeddedness look like? And I think that's where the work that we're doing now. I said coffee is full of myth making, and the biggest myth, and we're really not sure, but it's a fantastic story, is that of Kaldi, who's this goat herd in Ethiopia where coffee is grown wild, the only place where Arabica was grown wild. And he kind of followed his goats into the forest and found that they were behaving really weird after eating these red berries. Not kind of, being restful at night when he put them into their pen. So he followed them for a few days, started bringing back some of the fruit that these goats were eating, and found it did something to him too. And it's from that then that I think he took it back to the closest monastery, so he gave it to some of the Sufi mystics who were there. They got upset, threw that fruit into the fire. It was roasted, and that's kind of where that heady smell and fragrance came from, and they were curious, and that's how it started. That's how the first consumption of coffee started, according to what is the most popularly believed story, the origin story of coffee. And of course, when people discovered it kept them awake at night, through prayers, through rituals, it started really being consumed, till of course people got super upset about the fact that people were consuming coffee. And as it kind of moved, this guy was the most upset, right? So this is Ottoman Sultan Murad IV, I think, and he's the most effective as well as for punishing people to consume coffee. I think he threw 10,000 people into the Bosphorus for hanging out in coffee shops and consuming coffee. And the problem was that when you had a drink that was not an intoxicant, but that would bring people together to gather, they would talk. And they would always talk about people in power, and that was always seen as a problem, right? And so it's that fact that most plans to overthrow the Sultan came from people chatting in coffee shops is the reason why there was an absolute prohibition on the consumption of coffee across the Arab world where really the trade began. It's that prohibition that sort of pushed coffee out into coffee houses of Vienna, of Paris, of Rome, and coffee came out into Europe. We don't know very much about how coffee came to India. Again, there are these really, really vivid myths about the Sufi saint Baba Budan, who took 7 coffee beans in his belt and brought them from Mecca. We don't know if it's true. What we do know through historical archive information is the most systematic plantations were started by the East India Company sometime around the early 1800s. And this is a photograph of parts of Tellicherry where coffee was first brought. And what's fascinating about this piece of historical work and this was part of my own PhD work is that it's completely the opposite of what we're told about how coffee in India started. And this disconnect to me as a conservationist is stark, because we've always talked about and promoted Indian coffee as being shade grown, right? So wherever you go to any trade show across the world where the government of India has trade booths, where big coffee companies from the country have different kind of displays, or wherever, any website of any brand or company, green coffee commodity, hundreds of years, you'll always see the fact that Indian coffee is shade grown. And the big kind of push in the global market is that compared to how coffee is grown in Brazil and Colombia and Guatemala and everywhere else where rainforests were cleared to grow coffee, we didn't clear the rainforest to grow coffee. We planted coffee within the forest. Now, when I started doing this work and we found historical archives, we found lots and lots of paintings and photographs that actually showed that the first thing that the colonizers did is completely clear fell the forest to grow coffee. So these myths about sustainable coffee in India being shade grown are absolutely not true, right? And so coffee here looks like tea. It's like vast rolling hills of coffee that were planted with no forest cover in sight. And the reason that they did it is even more interesting. The first is, of course, forests were teeming with wildlife then. And so it was just unsafe for people to be in these forest areas where there was so much wildlife, from tigers to elephants to leopards and so on. And they could shoot as many as they would see, but there was still a lot of wildlife back then. The second is that the British really didn't know how to grow coffee. The only reference they had was how to grow wheat in Europe. And so they took those references of how wheat and grain are grown in temperate regions and applied that for how coffee should be grown in India. And of course it didn't work. And the reason it didn't work is that coffee as a plant needs shade. And it cannot be grown under direct sunlight. And there's lots of disclaimers and caveats to that, but primarily coffee in India cannot be grown under the direct sun. And so what the British planters had to do was plant back the forest after completely clear felling it. And what we see now as shade grown is really the outcome of that action. The action of planting back a forest, because you realize the plant you're growing needs shade cover. Which for me was a very, very interesting disconnect. The fact that actually forest plays an ecological function, not just a marketing function in the way that we use in trade shows across the world for the narrative building, but really the ecological function of forests was so important back then. There's immense human costs of coffee. Unlike most commodities in the world, tea being the most, you'll have to pull me back and forgive me if I do a tea versus coffee, if I go on that rampage. But compared to commodities like tea, coffee is primarily grown by smallholder producers. And globally, 70% of coffee is grown on 10 hectares or less. That's kind of what the reference of a smallholder grower is. 10 hectares is about 24 acres. In India, that's 83%. So really, we grow coffee on small parcels of land. And the average landholding where we work is about half an acre or 1 acre. So very small parcels of land, not large parcels of land at all. And therefore, when we think of what the challenges are that smallholder farmers face, they range from so many things, right? It's access to market, finding a good buyer for their coffees, being much more vulnerable in the face of any kind of climatic event, not necessarily having the access or infrastructure to grow and produce or manage their farms in a way a much larger plantation would. So many, many challenges. And I kind of skipped the part from sort of 1850 on to now, but essentially what happened is that when the British planters left, those parcels of land were then given away to people they were friends with. And so the closer you were to someone in the East India Company, the larger the parcel of land you got, and that's been therefore further sort of divided. In the areas we work, actually we realize that much of coffee is also grown by indigenous communities. And how they started growing coffee is, again, a very bittersweet story, right? In this region, which is the Biligiri Rangan Hills in Karnataka, and here Nanjegowda and his wife Geeta are part of the Soliga tribal community. They started growing coffee because when they were growing, well, their community first was, it's a hunting gathering community, and so they practiced shifting cultivation within the forest. And when that area was declared a tiger reserve by the Wildlife Protection Act in 1972, their earlier traditional practices of shifting, of hunting, of gathering, of foraging were completely now settled into agriculture. They were no longer given the rights by the government. Their rights were no longer recognized to do some of the things they were doing earlier. And so they were settled in no longer nomadic homes or settlements, but permanent settlements. And then they were told to start settled agriculture. And they tried growing millet. They would grow jowar and ragi. But there's, again, so much wildlife in these areas that the offtake from wildlife for food is too high. And so the search began for something that wildlife didn't eat. And that's how coffee came to be. In many, many parts of the country where you have indigenous communities cultivating really close to the forest. I want to say, the kind of thread that runs through all of this and the work that we do now and as I think about the work that I do, is constantly this question of, is coffee a good thing or a bad thing, right? Is it grown in areas that were forest? Is it grown by people who were earlier growing food and are now dependent on a global cash crop? There's all of these tensions that exist that are inherent to so many of the things that we eat and consume, and certainly with coffee it feels really alive. There's now this new dimension that really wasn't there when I began my work in coffee, which is climate. Because we know now that by 2080, I think that we're no longer probably going to be drinking coffee in the same way, or it's going to be extremely expensive. So the price of coffee is already kind of, last year was very, very high. We hit a 27-year record high in the price of coffee. But areas where coffee can be grown are now shrinking because temperatures are rising. This rise in temperature certainly impacts things like rainfall, so the blossoming of the flower, the fruit set, the kind of fruit you get per plant is going down. But we're also seeing more pest and disease outbreaks than we've ever seen before. So there's many of these. There's this like kind of yellow powdery thing that you see on the underneath of this leaf is something called leaf rust, which is the most widespread fungal outbreak in coffee. In fact, when the British took coffee to Sri Lanka and to India, coffee in Sri Lanka doesn't exist anymore because of leaf rust. So it just totally spread. All the plants died out, and Sri Lanka now no longer grows coffee in the same way as it did. So it's a really fast growing fungal disease made much, much worse by changing climate. We're familiar with the flavor of coffee, and we're familiar with certain beans, right? We know Arabica beans, we know Robusta beans, some of you might know Liberica beans. But there was so much coffee that used to exist that now no longer does. And this Ambongo coffee is, I think, from Congo, where we've just no longer been grown. We no longer have the conditions in which these kinds of coffees can be grown. So even if you're not so empathetic or clued in or interested in the human story or the environmental story, even if you like just the flavor of coffee, there's flavors that we no longer are even being able to try because habitat or area available for coffee is shrinking because of climate. And of course, everyone's super worried, right? Because nothing fuels the global economy like coffee does. many biodiversity concerns as well. And we talked about shade as being a huge tension, right? And coffee has a challenging, the plant has a challenging, not, no, it has a complex relationship with shade. Over the short term, it likes sun, but over the long term, it likes shade. Um, and, um, and it means that in the earlier days, before people had access to, let's say, things, and the reason that coffee needs shade is because, in India we have very hot and dry summers. And so it's at that time that you need a tree canopy over your coffee to protect the plant from drying out. And also in the earlier days, people didn't use fertilizer in the way they do now, and the leaf litter from the trees that you had on your farm really provided for that nutrient. So it's for those reasons that historically we planted back, the British planted back shade onto farms. Now things have changed, and again, we have remote sensing data in India that shows that from 1970 to now, we've lost forest cover on coffee in coffee growing regions. And that's because people have access to irrigation, so they no longer need shade trees to protect coffee plants from dry summers. And they also now have access to heat and drought resistant varietals of coffee. So that's really been the big push globally. So most of R&D in coffee, sustainability wise too, has gone into finding varietals that are resistant to changing climate. It hasn't gone back into looking at what the cause of it is. It's gone back into finding ways to adapt. And so you see that coffee has moved from what could have been a rustic-ish system in the early 1900s up onto something that's much more monoculture. And a lot of it is also influenced by what the government has told us, right? So we've prioritized productivity over sustainability, of course, but we've also prioritized productivity over flavor. So we're known in India to not produce the most flavorful coffee, but we produce a lot. That's what our push has always been. And so a lot of farms look like this, which is coffee is the undergrowth, and then all of these trees you see are single species. They're one kind of tree. You don't see a variety or a diversity of tree. This particular tree is silver oak, which many of you might be familiar with. There's some in Goa, I'm told. And silver oak is an Australian exotic that's been imported into India because we have permissions to plant and remove it. So again, there's a tension with what farmers are allowed to do on their farms and not, right? So as a farmer, if I'm growing coffee somewhere, I own the land, but not what's on the land. So I don't have permissions to cut many of the forest trees, and so therefore, often I make the choice to plant something I do have the permission to cut, which is an exotic like this. So just many, many layers. And we've studied coffee a lot globally and here because it's grown in areas that are biodiversity hotspots. So for example, a collaborator of ours, and I'll show you the thing and hopefully you can hear it, has actually spent many years, Vijay Ramesh, who's an ornithologist who studied birds in different habitats. So from, let's say you took shaded coffee versus unshaded coffee versus tea, right? Or you took a really disturbed patch of coffee versus the forest. How are birds using these areas differently? I'll tell you what it is. Essentially, he finds two things. He finds the species diversity much higher in areas that are primary forest as opposed to restored or disturbed areas. The other thing he finds is a much higher diversity of insects as well. So these recorders now pick up not only bird song but also insects, and insects as a proxy for what is the diversity of species that exist. And it's this kind of research that really tells us that, even if we needed evidence that how you grow coffee impacts biodiversity, it's really having this kind of scientific work and collaborations with scientists who really tell us what exactly is going on given certain species. Of course, our challenge is always how do you make it valuable to a farmer as well, right? And the goal being, okay, so let's say our goal is that, okay, farmers must see the value of having the Malabar whistling thrush on their farm. A very utilitarian view of looking at it, but sometimes it's useful to think about it from the farmer's perspective. Why do I want all of these birds on my farm as a farmer? I'll add another layer of complexity if it wasn't already complex, and that's around certifications. And this is what I spent a lot of time working on before we started the business, which is to say, what is the impact of these certifications, right? Certifications are the most widespread way of identifying and labeling commodities. And we now are constantly looking and buying things that are organic, that may be fair trade. Globally, of course, there's many. There's some what might be relevant to a place like Goa is the Marine Stewardship Councils, the MSC, which certifies seafood. You have the FSC that certifies paper and timber coming from different landscapes. And so we use certifications as a way of really identifying as consumers what's coming from a place that's grown sustainably. And again, we found that through really understanding what certifications do on the ground, that for certain commodities, coffee being the big one, that most certifications had very limited transformation potential. And this isn't talking about organic, but it's talking about some of the bigger ones. Organic's a very small part of what we do in India. But the biggest ones globally would be something like the Rainforest Alliance certification, that's huge, and the UTZ certification, which has now changed. But both, like let's say, Starbucks or Nestle or Kraft or Sara Lee or Chibo, the really big coffee companies would be using these certifications as a way of telling their consumers that their coffee is actually sustainable. And you know, when, of course, when you write all of this up as academic work, nobody's interested, right? It doesn't change or move anything on the ground. And what was really obvious to us when we kind of did it is we found that all of this, so basically what I'm saying is that coffee from farms that look like all of this end up in a cup of coffee that's Rainforest Alliance certified. And so it means, and not all of this is from India, the top two pictures are from India, but the rest are from Colombia, Brazil, and Indonesia. But you can see that if you were a bird or an insect or an elephant, that these would be very different habitats, right? But the certification standards are actually sometimes so low that all of these would fall in the bucket of what would be quote-unquote sustainable coffee. And it ends up in the same cup. And so we began to see, okay, coffee is super complex, there's lots of these different layers, and a huge layer now is the fact that what is the most widespread way to deal with coffee and sustainability isn't really working on the ground. And so the question became for us, how do we build an alternative? And that's what the business really attempts to do, is to say if you had to build an alternative, some kind of market relationship with farmers that actually looked at what biodiversity existed on farms, would we be able to do that? What is the way to do that? And what does that mean? And so the first thing is, you know, we now work across the Western Ghats, and a lot of the work goes into actually building capacity, because now climate's something that wasn't an issue back then, but growers are really finding ways and growers are really struggling with how to adapt to changing climate. It means that their yields are going up and down. It means they're having all of these pest and disease outbreaks. And when you're smallholder farmers, we were really keen that we're able to find low-cost, efficient ways to enable people to address these issues better. And so we do a lot of work on training people how to cultivate coffee in a time of climate change. Some of that looks like visual material, a lot of it looks like this. So one of the most interesting programs we started was a YouTube channel that was run by farmers themselves, where they would find progressive farmers and tell the stories of, okay, how is so-and-so growing his coffee, how is she doing things differently, and that became a really popular way of people leading the movement to kind of share that rather than us from the outside. Um, I think kind of sharing the story of where and how coffee is grown, who is the non-human on these farms is really crucial. And we try and do that in many ways. The first is we try and constantly tell that to people who are drinking coffee, right? So you know that your coffee is not coming only from a farm, but there's actually a lot of other stuff that's happening on a farm. And this is the interesting story of this particular individual leopard called Chuki. And we found her on our camera traps about 5 years ago. Camera trap is just a research tool to try and see what are some of the mammals, larger mammals that are using coffee farms. And they tell us, of course, because so many of these animals are shy and so many of them use farms at night, they tell us who's using these farms as a way of really understanding what is the biodiversity that exists. And so Chuki's been coming back and forth from Ketegowda's farm for about 3-4 years now. And the fact that she's not just, the fact that we see her often really tells us about the fact that the human disturbance on these farms is safe enough, is low enough that she feels comfortable and safe coming. Um, and uh, and that's how we kind of, so you know, you can take that and turn it into a story that can maybe find a connection with someone who's drinking that coffee. But we began to see quite a lot of restoration of native vegetation as well. And you can see that, you know, once you start talking to growers about the fact that, okay, shade is important, particularly important in changing climate. There's a market relationship now that guarantees a price, a competitive price, a long-term arrangement. It removes some of the speculation and uncertainty from many of the buying relationships that smallholder growers are generally used to. To give you an example, when we first started working, the price differential that between what we would buy coffee at and what the kind of farm gate traders would buy coffee at, it was something like 56%. So huge exploitation of farmers, extraction from the land, that kind of is the default. And if you're trying to change that, it means actually sometimes economic security precedes biodiversity conservation in many of these areas. And that's what we start seeing. We see that farmers are actually quite okay letting some of that shade cover come back. I'm going to stop, and I'll stop with just a few stories and examples. This is Mada. Mada does an experimental coffee for us. And so for us as a brand, it becomes interesting to kind of put out new flavors. But for him and the market relationship, the actual core of why we do it is the fact that he gets a premium that he can use. And so Mada was able to start a small shop in his village and repair his roof just with the differential that he received for doing some of these specialty coffees. Similarly, this is Madama. Madama produces an anaerobic naturals, right? And the market really wants an anaerobic naturals. So it's interesting. But beyond just doing that as a brand, if we have to go a little bit deeper, similarly to Madama was able to pay back her debt. So again, debt is something we see very commonly in smallholder coffee, in the way that we see with most agricultural commodities. And she was actually able to pay back her debt just through producing these kinds of specialty coffees. Ketama was able to buy livestock with that. And Kollegowda was able to buy a bike on which he takes his wife for a ride every day. So that was super sweet. And we still see Chuki. So she's still there. And in addition to Chuki, we see this guy. And this guy is seen here on the camera eating jackfruit. And Sandrangegoda, whose farm he's on, knows he's going to come. And so the way of coexisting with this guy is to actually just leave the low-hanging jackfruit on the tree. Because he's smart enough that he knows he has to push the tree, but if he pushes the tree too hard, then he loses his source of jackfruit. So he knows he's not going to do that. So the smartest way is just to kind of loosely shake the low-hanging jackfruit. And so that's what Sandrangegoda does. But we've seen very, very interesting things on our camera traps. That's a barking deer, and the barking deer on is a shy species of ungulate of deer that you find it across quite widespread, but they're quite shy everywhere. And the barking deer, to me and a lot of the farmers we speak to, keep talking about how they are super efficient de-weeders. And so you can actually put a weedicide on your coffee farm to remove the unwanted shrub, or you can just have a farm that's habitat for barking deer who are very efficiently pulling out all the unwanted weeds. But we've also seen gaur, of course, the world's largest bison, a tiger, and lots and lots and lots of elephants. I'm going to end with this interesting story, and I don't know whether you can see it, but you know, when you start looking at how wildlife is behaving on farms, and this is the part that excites me the most, of course, is you start seeing really interesting things you don't expect. And so this, over the past, I think over a couple of weeks, we saw this very interesting story unfold of an apex predator, the leopard. This is in Chuki, this is on someone else's farm, but apex predator and its prey. And we saw exactly the ulta. We'd see this leopard go down, and then 10 minutes later this wild boar would follow, and then the leopard would come up the hill, and then the wild boar would follow, and then the leopard would go down. And so we were just like, what is going on, right? Like, what are these two doing that we haven't caught on to? But just to sort of end there, and you know, the discussion I think to have as we end is that I think the more embedded you want to be in the politics of how something is grown, it really raises interesting questions for us. And you know, we know how long some of these processes take, right? So if you have a 200-year history of growing coffee in a way that's been extractive, how do you take that and change it? And then how do you change it with many, many, many growers across a contiguous landscape, right? That's the first one. How do you actually find ways to make coffee good habitat for wildlife when the default is not? The default is not that. The second is, how do you address economic issues with smallholder farmers, given that state support is totally different, given that everything is harder when you have half a piece of land on the edge of a forest. And the third is, what do you do when you're dealing with this in a market that's as big as it is? And whether it's in India or whether it's globally, the question of, is what you're doing in your small part of the world ever going to be enough? Is it worthwhile? Is it valuable? I think these are questions that we're constantly thinking about, but now asking more publicly for a conversation. I think for the first maybe 9 of 10 years, we did it really privately and moped about it. But now, as an organization of 10, we're really thinking about how do you hold conversations like this about thinking a bit more deeply about where what we consume comes from. Thank you.